All right, what's going on YouTube? This is BoxingWave, and we're back to discuss the welterweight division, okay? Now that Spence and Crawford won't be fighting now, all right, this kind of leaves the whole division in a messy situation, which I stated a couple videos ago when I addressed the breaking news of Bud Crawford fighting David Avanesian, all right? So since then, the new news is, as of today, both the IBF mandatory Jerron Ennis is going to be filing a petition to fight Errol Spence Jr. for that IBF strap. And Stanionis over by the WBA, he's going to be filing a petition to fight as well. So they're both mandatories for Errol Spence, who holds the WBC, the WBA, and the IBF titles, right? Terrence Bud Crawford holds the WBO title, which I believe he defended against his mandatory Sean Porter late last year, right? But it's been a year since he's fought, right? So in this video here, we're just going to talk about the welterweight division. What does this mean now that Bud and Spence are not fighting each other right now? I'm going to give you my views, but I'm going to also pull up the WBA, the WBC, the IBF, the WBO rankings so you can see for yourself exactly how everyone is ranked. And then we could talk about what I think is going to happen from here on and what are some of the options that we can do as far as moving forward, because this is clearly a division that needs a tournament, in my opinion. We had the World Boxing Super Series going on. Unfortunately, with that series, most of the divisions that were involved weren't the big money divisions. You know what I'm saying? So you had bantamweight there, you had junior welterweight there, you had cruiserweight there, you had super middleweight there, but you didn't have like the lightweight division that really needs one. You know what I'm saying? Of course, you didn't have the heavyweight division. You didn't have the welterweight division, right? So certain divisions like the middleweight division, where no one fights each other in that division at all, there's divisions that really need a tournament. And in this, like I've said with the lightweight division as well, you have Spence, who is unified. You have Crawford, who holds the title. But then you got all of these undefeated fighters right underneath them that's really knocking on at their front door. You know what I'm saying? They're basically right there. Two of them are mandatories, and they're right there. And then you got some of the older guys, former champions like Keith Thurman, your Dennis Ugas, that's still hanging around, right? So you got prospects, you got top contenders, you got the older guys, and then you have the two champions, right? So we're going to discuss all of that. Again, I'm going to go over the rankings. And matter of fact, I'm going to start now by pulling up the WBA, and then we're going to discuss that ranking here. All right, so here's the WBA website here, and I scroll down to welterweight. All right, so right here it tells you right here, Errol Spence Jr. is a WBA super champion. So he's the top dog as far as a WBA strap, because they have multiple straps. So what they're trying to do is consolidate most of their straps, their titles in each division. So you got Stanionis here, who is the WBA world champion, who he won against Butayev earlier this year, right? Good fight, right? Good win. So Stanionis is basically the mandatory. But then right underneath that, you have the actual rankings. Number 1 is Virgil Ortiz. 2 is Jerron Ennis. 3 is Keith Thurman. 4 kind of been Dennis Ugas, and so on. So even though Virgil Ortiz is number 1 here, he's not actually the mandatory. He's just the number 1 ranked. The mandatory is the world champion, who is Imantas Stanionis, right? So he is the guy that put in for the petition to fight Errol Spence Jr., right? He originally was the mandatory even before the Butayev fight. But since Butayev, I believe, was number 2 and he was number 1, and they basically made those two fight each other and the winner would fight Errol Spence. But Stanionis agreed to do a step aside for Spence, for Bud to fight each other. But being that they're not going to fight next, Stanionis is filing a petition in order to get that shot. Then when we go over to the IBF strap here, you see same thing. You know, it shows you the champion, Errol Spence Jr. They give you some dates here. Like you see the title won. He won this title in May of 2017 against Kell Brook. It says mandatory here, January 2019. I don't know if that was his first mandatory. I don't know what that date is saying, but I know defended it in December of 2020, which was against Danny Garcia in his return fight after he got into that car accident, right? So it gives you some more, you know, a little bit more details on anything, and they show you the other champions in each other sanctioning body. Now here, you see Jaron Ennis as the #1 guy, and he is currently putting in the petition to fight Errol Spence Jr. as well. All right, now I don't know who's gonna be in order to fight Errol, if Errol is gonna hold the titles and stuff. I don't know who's gonna be. I don't know if it's gonna be Ennis or Stanionis, because they're both mandatories from different sanctioning bodies, different belts. But Ennis is one of his mandatories. He's the #1 guy, and there's no 2 rated guy. But underneath him, there's Virgil Ortiz. So you're gonna see that in a lot of these fights, or a lot of these sanctioning bodies, it's the same 3 or 4 guys in order. All right. You got Connor Ben down here. You got Keith Thurman down there. You're going to see them on the other ones. You've seen them on the other ones. You saw them on the WBA one that I just posted, right? I believe one of the sanctioning bodies is 100% identical, I think, as far as the top 4 or 5 guys with this one. All right. So then we go over to the WBC ratings, right? Now, they have Keith Thurman as #1, right? How? I don't know why. I love Keith. You know, I know he lost to Pacquiao, but I don't mind him just getting a 1 fight and bouncing back to the #1. My problem is because he was a champion, he was a unified champion, and he only had 1 loss. My problem with Keith is his inactivity and his comeback fight being against junior welterweight who had just got knocked out in his previous fight. How do you move back up to the #1 spot when you have been fought in a couple years and you lose to Pacquiao? You fight a junior welterweight that got knocked out in his last fight, and it earned you a #1 spot again. So it's not like I'm trying to diss Keith, because I love Keith, but as far as him being a #1, it's kind of funny, right? So you got Keith as #1, but even though he's a #1, I don't believe he's the actual mandatory. He's just the #1 ranked guy. I think when he beat Mario Barrios, I think that was like a kind of like an eliminator, not a final eliminator, because they have different eliminators. So I don't believe that's a final eliminator. So there's probably going to be 1 more fight when it comes to the WBC to determine who's going to be the actual mandatory for the champion, whoever that is, if it's going to still be Errol Spence, right? So you see #2 is Virgil Ortiz Jr., Jaron Ennis. You got David Avanesian, whose Bud is going to be fighting, and you have Connor Ben. So very identical rankings. You got Ugas here too. So very identical ratings compared to the others. And then when you go over to the WBO rankings, who Terrence Crawford is currently the champion, he's going to be fighting a voluntary. It's basically a voluntary to fight David Avanesian, because David Avanesian is not a mandatory. He's not a #1 ranked guy or anything like that, all right? But his #1, Terrence Crawford #1, I believe Virgil Ortiz has been, I think he was always right under Sean Porter, who fought Terrence Crawford in his last fight. So Virgil Ortiz is #1 here. You got Jaron Ennis, who's #2, Keith Thurman, Connor Ben, Cody Crowdy. You got a lot. So you have David Avanesian at #6. So you got a lot of guys here that we're just familiar with. These guys are all here. You got Ortiz, and it's the same thing over and over again, right? So look, basically with this is what happens when there's 4 titles, major titles in a division, in each division. I mean, when you look at the 90s and even before that, when there were 3 major titles, right? It was hard to really unify those titles, you know, because you got to have the mandatories. You know, you have these fights that people want to see, but then you have the mandatories that you got to take care of too. And sometimes even unifying doesn't work. It's not an automatic way to avoid fighting in mandatory, because sometimes they just enforce the mandatories over the unification matches. Every sanctioning body has a different set of rules that they play by, right? So Ennis, I'm sorry, not Ennis, Errol or EJ. The problem with EJ is being that he holds 3 titles, and I said this a couple videos ago when I announced or broke the news about Terrence Crawford fighting David Avanesian. I said, most likely, if Errol and Bud fight each other, it will probably be at 154, and it will probably not be for undisputed. Even if they decide to stay at 147, it will probably not be for undisputed, because you're not going to be able to hold these guys off. They're signing petitions, all right? Bud is going to have a fight. I wouldn't be surprised if Spence have a fight. I don't know what Spence is going to do. I don't know what the IBF and the WBA is going to do if Spence decides to fight Stanionis, being that I believe he was a mandatory first. If he fights Stanionis over Boots, is the IBF going to strip Errol Spence? You just never know with these sanctioning bodies. Oh, they're going to work with him. But does Errol even want to stay at welterweight right now? Because he recently tweeted that he's struggling to make weight at 147. I mean, he's always been pretty big at the division as is. So is he even going to stay at the division? Is he going to just drop the titles? How is that going to work? I mean, it sucks because he worked to get these titles in order to go into a undisputed fight, but you got 3, you don't have the last piece. And now you got to fight guys like Stanionis and Jaron Ennis, which aren't easy fights. So what does Spence do? I believe that if they are truly going to revisit the fight, if they updated that contract, and if Bud just has this fight because he wants to stay active based on what he's saying, if he's going to have this fight and then go and revisit a Spence fight early next year, that's if Spence doesn't take a fight. But if he does it, then maybe Spence will keep the titles that he still have, that he won't get stripped of, and make that fight. But I don't believe that happens, because he's going to get stripped. So if you're going to get stripped by not fighting your mandatories, because if he, all right, let me start over. If Spence decides that he wants to hold his belt, he's going to have to stay at the division longer, right? And to make the fight undisputed, he would have to defend his titles against those mandatories. And who's to say that by that time he does that, who's to say that Keith Thurman won't be a mandatory by that time? You get what I'm saying? So in order to fight Bud, I personally believe it's a missed opportunity when it comes to it being undisputed. I think that's done. You know what I'm saying? That's over. That's over. Because now these guys are stepping up. They're filing petitions to fight you. So I think the undisputed fight is done. Now, that's a heavy blow. But at the end of the day, the priority to me is just seeing the fight. And I've been consistent with that, with them and with any other fighter, like Wilder and Joshua. I don't care whether they're the champions or not. I don't care if they take losses. I still want to see the fight. And that's going to stand when it comes to Bud and EJ. All right? So that's how I view it when it comes to that. I really believe that this division just needs a tournament. You know what I'm saying? Because I know that they're going after the top dogs. But as you can clearly see here, Ortiz and Ennis being either 1 or 2 or 3, or Keith Thurman being right there. Kind of been, obviously, he's not going to be in the picture, but those three, specifically Thurman, Boots, and Ortiz Jr., are going to have to find a way to fight each other. You know, they're going to have to fight each other at some point because they're all in a good space right now. Oh, and Stanionis. I'm sorry. I forgot Stanionis. They're all in a good space right now. You know, if they're willing to really want to fight each other, they're all in a good position right now. They might not be in the best position to fight Errol or Bud simply off that they try to make the fight. It didn't work out, but they try to make a fight. And I know Errol is not trying to stick around at 147 forever. I personally believe that Errol is going to move up to 154 because there's no way he's going to fight all of these mandatories. And if you do, and you're just defending your titles and possibly not fighting Bud Crawford, what's going to be the point of it? You know, what's going to be the point? Plus, since Bud is going to be active now and take a fight in December, you know, who's to say that Spence say, you know, I want to take a fight too before we fight. You know, he might just move up to 154 and say, you know what, I'm going to have a fight at 154, and then Bud will follow him up there. And that's what I think is going to happen. I really honestly believe that is going to be the option. You know, I think Spence really would stay at 147 if it's worth it. I think he's gotten to that point now that he just doesn't want to be at the weight anymore. And I don't know how long Jermell Charlo is sticking around either. You know, Jermell's not going to stick around. You know, I was thinking that maybe Jermell Charlo would stick around at 154 just to fight Fundora. And he might. He might. You know, but we just got to wait and see. But in the meantime, you know, when I look at these sanctioning bodies here, and when I look at specifically the WBC one, where Keith Thurman's the number one, you know, I don't know how that's going to work, you know, because he's technically not a mandatory right now. You know, but I could see EJ fighting him just because they could try to make a pay-per-view out of it based on Keith being in a prior pay-per-view with Manny Pacquiao, and because he probably has a name bigger than the other mandatories that are Errol Spence, like Boots and Stanionis. So I can see that being a possibility. You know, whether it's at 147, 154, or whatever. I don't know. But yeah, I'm really curious to see what happens here. You know, I'm really curious to see what Spence does. It's really more about Spence because we already know what Bud is doing. And if everything works out, he's going to be fighting David Avenesian next. And then at that point, I think if Bud can't secure a Spence fight next year, you know, if they can't work it out and they can't resolve whatever business issues they have, I think the best person to go to for Bud is to try to get a Virgil Ortiz fight. You know, that's the other best option because he is not a PBC fighter. All right, or maybe the PBC can explore other fights with Bud, but I think if Bud doesn't work it out with Spence, I think he's done. I think he's already done with Top Rank, and I think he may be done with the PBC if things doesn't work out, or maybe even now. I don't even know. All right, but I think if Spence is going to be, if Bud is going to be sticking around at 147. He is probably better off trying to get the Virgil Ortiz fight. And I'm curious to see if Virgil Ortiz is going to exercise his mandatory position in the WBO because he is the number one guy currently. I don't know if he's the mandatory yet, but I'm sure he will be at least by the beginning of next year, if not the end of this year. All right. So there's a lot that needs to be done here. I just wish at this point, and you know what? Let me make, this is one thing that I wanted to address when it came to this topic. When it comes to filing petitions, in order to get a mandatory shot, I think that more fighters, especially the younger fighters, need to take notice. Okay, all these fights that you either choose to step aside for, or you're just waiting for your position, you need to be more aggressive when it comes to these sanctioning bodies, because at the end of the day, not all of them, but most of them just want their money. You know, they bend the rules a lot for certain fighters. You know, there are fighters that are inactive and they get stripped, and there's other fighters that are inactive as well and they don't get stripped. Okay, so being that the sanctioning bodies are never consistent, you want to put pressure, you know. And I think when I see Boots and Stanionis putting in filing petitions, it makes me think of Devin Haney and his situation with Lomachenko when he was the mandatory for Lomachenko. Mauricio Suleiman, who is the president of the WBC, Mauricio Suleiman said that Devin Haney did not file for a petition when Lomachenko was granted the franchise title without having to fight his mandatory. Devin Haney could have petitioned for it. And Mauricio Suleiman, in a live interview with Bill Haney, the father of Devin Haney, he asked him, why didn't you petition for it? You know? So being that happened at that time, I think these younger fighters or these top contenders that are coming up and they're looking to get a title shot and they really want it bad, like Stanionis do, like Boots do, they're not playing no games. I mean, this news with Terrence Crawford and David Avenesian came out 2 days ago, and these guys already filed a petition to fight. All right, and they're making it known that they want their fight. They want their championship shot. They're not playing around. So I don't know how that's gonna work. You know, I mean, in a perfect world, what would I want? Well, I would want a four-way tournament between Keith Thurman, Stanionis, Jerron Ennis, and Virgil Ortiz Jr. And I would just love for Spence and Bud to fight and do their thing so they can go on with their careers. But that's not in the world. That's not the world we're living in. You know, right now, Bud is fighting David Avenesian. Spence, we're still left with what he's going to do, but he's stuck with a bunch of mandatories right now. Don't know if he's going to go up to 154. Again, he tweeted about that recently, and he's always said that he was willing to, he's been wanting to go up to 154. So with that being said, I would like these other four ranked guys, highly ranked guys, to fight each other. You know, it just doesn't make sense for them to be ranked that high in the top four, the four of them, and none of them are fighting each other. You know, I think something needs to happen when it comes. And if you really think about it, it should be a lot easier than the two guys that are currently champions to make these fights and unify, because you're already ahead of the game. All these guys are already ahead of the game, and they're already ranked high. They're already ranked high. A couple of them are mandatories, and you know, a couple of them are like probably just a little bit of time from being a mandatory. So with that being said, it should be easier to unify the four of these titles if Spence and Bud doesn't fight for undisputed by next year. It should be easy to collect these belts because the same four guys are highly ranked there, unless one of them decides to go up to 154, one or two of them. And I think if anybody goes up to 154, it will probably be Ennis, you know, because he's very big at 154. He's even bigger than Spence. And maybe Keith Thurman, simply because if a Spence or a Bud chooses to go up to 154 or something like that, I can see Keith Thurman following them. I can see Keith Thurman possibly having a rematch with Danny or something, because Keith is looking for the big fights, and I don't think Keith is looking to stick around and fight one of these up-and-coming top contenders like Boots or Ortiz or Stanionis, because there's no money in that fight like it would be for a Bud Crawford or EJ, Errol Spence. So, long story short, man, the welterweight division is a mess. It's a mess. It's a complete mess. And I don't believe that Errol is going to just commit to keeping all of these belts. I know he worked hard and won fights and getting them, but keeping them without having a big, huge money fight, I don't see it happening. I just don't see it. Especially with like fighting like a guy like Ennis, which is, I know he's not as proven and experienced as Errol is, but I've read countless comments of people that believe that Boots can beat them both right now. When I say the both of them, I mean EJ and Bud. All right, there's a lot of people that believe that Ennis is that good already, and I'm not too far from that. I don't know if I'm there now with that, but I'm not too far from that. All right, you give him a little bit more time, maybe a year's tops, and I will be openly just saying like Boots could beat them both, depending on how he looks in his next upcoming fights. And he's actually looking to fight in December. All right. But I also believe that Virgil Ortiz is growing a young star, and he is going to have a name. Keith Thurman is a guy that has had a name. All right. And Stanionis don't have the name, probably is the less known, but is a threat. All right. He's a very good boxer. All right, I'm getting tired, man. I hope I cleared up this whole WBC. This whole sanctioned and body welterweight thing. And I'll see you guys tomorrow in the morning. We'll talk more boxing. I got breakdowns coming. All right, peace. Have a good night.